right, good morning. We've jumped into this series on Daniel, and just to kind of let you know, set you up on this, Daniel is such a great story in the Old Testament, and it's really good to go and look at the Old Testament stories because you can tie them to the New Testament, and you realize that it's the same God. It's just it's the plan that it goes through, and it all sets up who Jesus is also. But there's so much to learn just looking at the stories of Joseph and Abraham and Moses' story and Joshua. And Daniel's just a really good story. The very first week we said one of the reasons was because Daniel had this, which I think it's kind of the key to the book. Daniel had this foundation in his life. And the foundation may not be what you think the foundation was. In fact, that's really the point of Daniel's story, is Daniel's foundation was not based on the fact of the land of Israel or the land of Judah, which is, he came from the southern kingdom, Judah. Israel by his time had already been conquered, but Judah was still there, which Jerusalem was a part of. It's not based on that land. It's not actually even based on Jerusalem, which is, such an important city and such an important place. It wasn't even based on the fact that the temple was there. This was Solomon's temple in his day. And if you don't know the history, 605 is when Daniel is taken with some of the other young men. He's taken to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar as they conquer. But Nebuchadnezzar comes back about 7 or 8 years later, hits Jerusalem again, takes about 10,000 this time, including one of the prophets. Then he comes in 586. So about 20 years later, he comes back and he hits Jerusalem again. And this time he's so mad. Nebuchadnezzar is so ticked off at them that he absolutely levels Jerusalem and Solomon's temple. It's gone. I mean, he levels the thing because he is really ticked off. So it shows that all of those things and even all those places was not the basis of his foundation. Instead, if you read Daniel's story, here's what you come up with. You really can't miss it. The foundation of Daniel's life is what? His relationship to who? God, yeah, absolutely. It's the one thing that stays with Daniel through all the situations, all the struggles of his life, all the circumstances of his life, is this relationship that Daniel has with God. He goes and prays to God. He goes and asks God for wisdom. He even, we talked about, he even changed some of his, what was going on in there in the land of Babylon, what he would eat, and all based on who God was. And this was so important and so key for Daniel's life, and it is so important, so key for your life and my life. Because Daniel's going to face, and I love this part of the story, Daniel's going to face a time in his life where he's really asked to do what can't be done. He's really asked to do something that you look at and you say, well, it's not even possible. How can that be done? And I know you think, or some of you may think, well, I've never been there before. It's coming. There's a time when you'll be asked to do what can't be done, and there's a reason for it. In fact, this is the first thing in your outline. There's a reason that Daniel is asked to do what can't be done. And Daniel's life actually points to it. It starts to make that clear. Now, it might not be what you think. It's not that Daniel has answers, and you're going to see this as we look at this passage, that other men, he was just better or smarter as a guy than other people were. But it was all based on the foundational part of Daniel's life. So let me jump into it. This is chapter number 2 in Daniel, his Old Testament book. And this is what it says. One night during the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had such disturbing dreams that he couldn't sleep. Apparently, it's just one dream. But in saying it this way, apparently it's something that he had over and over again. He called in his magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers, and these are sort of descriptions of his advisors and his wise men at the time, and the different skills and the different ways that they would try to ascertain the future. And it says in verse 2, he called them in and he demanded that they tell him what he had dreamed. As they stood before the king, he said, I have had a dream that deeply troubles me, and I must know what it means. Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, and this is a switch in Daniel's book from Hebrew now he goes to. This is in Aramaic. He says, "Long live the king. Tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means." But the king said to the astrologers, "I'm serious about this. If you don't tell me what my dream was and what it means, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. But if you tell me what I dreamed and what the dream means, I will give you many wonderful gifts and honors. Just tell me the dream and what it means." So this is one of those requests. You have to understand and remember who Nebuchadnezzar was. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was a ruthless king. I mean, he was just the epitome of an egomaniac, and he was proud, he was arrogant. This is how he lived. This is how he saw himself. In many instances, it looks like Nebuchadnezzar viewed himself as a god himself, but he set up his own gods, and this is just how he dealt with life. They ruled, and Nebuchadnezzar ruled with absolute fear, because if you crossed him, it could cost you your life, because he could do, in his own mind, he could do anything he wanted without any repercussions at all because of who he was. So this is the land that they are taken into, that they must live in. So he's made these demands because he wants to know. It bothers him, and he has thought this through, and he has decided, if you could tell me the future, if you could tell me what the dream means, that means you could also tell me the dream itself. You can tell me the past. And they're like, well, no, whoa, you're going to see. They're like, no, hang on. But Nebuchadnezzar is a smart dude. And look at what it says in verse 7. They said to him again, "Please, your majesty, tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means." Verse 8, the king replied, "I know what you're doing. You're stalling for time because you know I am serious when I say, if you don't tell me the dream, you are doomed. So you have conspired to tell me lies, hoping I will change my mind. But tell me the dream, and I'll know that you can tell me what it means." And it says in verse 10, the astrologers replied to the king. Don't you love this part? I think this is just too good. This whole paragraph, we could spend at least a week on this. In fact, maybe we should. We won't do that. But it is just such a loaded paragraph. The astrologers replied to the king, "No one on earth can tell the king his dream. It can't be done. Who could possibly tell you what you dreamed?" But these are the same guys that are saying, "But we can tell you what dreams mean. We can tell you the future, right? We can tell you what's coming. But no one could tell you what your dream was, since you've not told anyone, what it is." And look at the next sentence. "And no king, however great or powerful, has ever asked such a thing of any magician, enchanter, and astrologer." So these guys had been there, most of them, before Nebuchadnezzar got there. So, he inherited them as king. Now, if you remember Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, all those guys, they were about 15 when they are brought into to Babylon, and they're brought in these positions. But these guys have been there a long time. And they're saying, listen, it's not done this way. No one has ever done this to us before. We will go through all our methodology. Some of them cast spells, some look at the stars. We'll go through all the things that we do. We can conjure up some sort of meaning of your dreams, but we can't. No one has ever asked us to actually tell them what the dream itself is. Nebuchadnezzar's smart. He's saying, listen, if you could see the future, if you could tell me what it means, you could also tell me the past. You could tell me exactly what it was that I dreamed that bothered me so much. And then I like verse number 11. Here's what they say. The king's demand is what? It's impossible. Cannot be done. No one, and then it is loaded, no one except the gods can tell you your dream. And they do not live here among people. Isn't that great? It would take a god to be able to tell you what your dream was. And there aren't any in this room, right? That's what he's saying. You look around here, there aren't any of those around here. We're all just men. So what you're asking is absolutely impossible. Cannot be done. You ever found yourself in a situation like that? Because Daniel's about to find himself in this situation. Even though Daniel is not here in the room during this time, probably because of their age and their newness as those who are brought from a new land, he is still considered to be a part of this group and will suffer the consequences of this along with the whole group. So he is going to be brought into this situation. Ever been brought in a situation where you're absolutely asked to do what you realize you cannot do? Cannot be done. Just can't be done. Can't be done. And then you stop and you ask yourself this question: God, why? Why am I in this situation? Why has this happened? See, Daniel is giving us a story of his life of being brought exactly into a situation like that, just like you might find yourself in life, and telling us he's going to go through. This is what you do in the midst of a story like this. This is what you do in a situation like this, which is why this part of the story is just so powerful. It finishes out there in verse number 13, and it says, "And because of the king's decree, men were sent to find and kill Daniel and his friends," because that's, again, like I said, they were part of the same group. So Daniel understands something that they don't understand. And let me try to explain this one. Daniel understands the why. And that's usually the thing that we're asking. God, why? Why is this happening? Why is this like this? But Daniel understands the why. Now, hang on. I'm not saying Daniel understands all the whys and hows of how things happen. Daniel understands something that is so much more fundamental. It's so much more foundational. Daniel understands that God has his own ways and God has his own plans. And you and I go through things like this where we have no one to turn to but God for a reason, right? So that we would do what? We would turn to, because we would realize there's no one else to turn to. There's no one else who can help me in this situation. Daniel understands the why of this. And that's hard for us. Because most of the time, until you get to the point where you have nowhere else to turn but to God, you won't turn to God. Not fully, not in the same way. But if you've gone through that, as Daniel goes through it, it is a life-changing thing as far as your understanding of who God is. In the Old Testament, there's another book called the Book of Job. If you're looking for a job, there's a book in there. Well, it's actually Job. Yeah, okay. But it's spelled the same way. And the book of Job is actually considered to be kind of a contemporary of a lot of the prophets that were writing at this time. It was written at this time. And if you know Job's story, Job has got really long books. So, just to kind of give you the Clef Notes on it, it's a really long book. But it's a story of a guy who was considered to be righteous in God's eyes. Doesn't mean he was sinless. It means that he sought God and he trusted God, and so he attempted to live his life in a way that he believed would please God. That was kind of the story of Job's life, and yet Job loses everything. Everything. His family's wiped out, all except his wife, and his wealth is wiped out, his position is wiped out, and it goes to this really, really, really long book, and Job's answer at the end of the book is not what you would think, because Job is asking the question, God, why? What did I do? Why am I going through this? What are you trying to do? What is the point? And at the end of the book, here's Job's answer. Job's answer is, and it comes from God himself. God says, in the end, Job, here's the only thing you need to understand. I am your God. I have never forsaken you. I have always shown compassion and mercy to you. I would not forsake you now. And Job at the end says, you're right. That's actually the answer that I'm looking for, because I can't figure everything out. I don't know the answers to everything. He actually goes through about 3 chapters where God just kind of just throws things at him. Do you understand this? Do you understand this? Do you understand how I made this? Do you know what I did? And Job's like, no, I don't know. No. Of course you don't. But here's what you need to understand. Here's the important thing that you need to understand. I'm still with you. I've never forsaken you. I've never deserted you. And Job realizes, that's exactly what I needed to know. That's exactly what I needed to figure out. This is what Daniel figures out. Daniel figures out the why, but usually it's not the why that you and I, the one that we're looking for. So here's the next verse. This is verse number 14. It says, when Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, came to kill them, so he's coming after them also, Daniel handled the situation, catch this, with wisdom and discretion. You know what that means? Daniel wasn't panicked. Daniel didn't freak out. Daniel didn't say, woe is me, what has happened? And I'm sure he was deeply concerned. But Daniel, again, because of this foundation in his life, this relationship with God, Daniel still had a trust in God and looking to God, even in the midst of these questions, even in the midst of these things that he was facing. And so it says in the next verse, verse 15, he asked Arioch, why has the king issued such a harsh decree? See, for Daniel, this just makes sense. Why would the king be so tough on all of his advisors? Why would he do this? I mean, this is incredibly extreme. Why would he do this? What is going on with the king? Why would he issue something like this? And so Arioch told him all that had happened. Verse 16, it says, Daniel went at once to see the king and requested more what? More time to tell the king what the dream meant. Now, this is exactly the thing that the other conjurers and astrologers and soothsayers, what they had asked for, more time. He wouldn't give them more time because Nebuchadnezzar did not trust them in what they were asking for. Obviously, there was a different trust with Daniel, and we'd already learned in the first chapter that Daniel had shown a superior ability to even hear dreams and visions and interpret those. So he has a great respect for this young man, Daniel, coming in, who asks for more time. He gives him more time, and it says in verse 17, then Daniel went home and told his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that's their Hebrew names, what had happened. So I'm going to give you 5 things that are here in this next part of the passage that concern Daniel's approach, Daniel's understanding of the why, and how Daniel gets to this understanding of the why. So that as you go through things like this, you can say, okay, that's a totally different approach than what I thought Daniel would take, or I thought I would take if I were in this situation. And so I can learn from Daniel's approach to how he goes after this when he's in an impossible situation. When there's stuff that he can't do this. He can't fix this or figure this out. And so here is his approach. The first thing is they asked for Daniel, Shadrach, and Meshach. They asked God for mercy. Now see, I don't know about you, but I would have thought, no, God, give me answers, right? Give me wisdom. Give me knowledge. But their request of God is based on their relationship to God and who God is. And so they ask God for mercy because they know that's who God is. God is a merciful and a compassionate God. We are limited. We've always been limited. We get puffed up and think, highly of ourselves, but we are still very limited. God is unlimited. God can do whatever He wants to do. God is the creator of all of this. He is the one that breathed life into us. Everything in the past was His past. Everything in the future is still a part of His future. He has never lost control of any of it. That's how Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they view it. They look at God in this way. And so they appeal to this characteristic of God that they understand about Him, that God is merciful. God is merciful. It's just who He is. And that's the part that they appeal to. I have parents come to me, and happens if you're a parent, maybe a grandparent, I'm in that stage now, that your kids or your grandkids will ask you questions and you don't know the answer, right? Anybody there? In fact, I have parents all the time come to me and they'll give me their questions and I go, oh my goodness, They can come up with the most amazing things, and as they think through things and ask things. And so here's what I have learned. I don't know the answer to all their questions. And I don't need to make them up either, right? Just admit sometimes you don't know the answer. But what I've also learned to do, and I did this with my kids, and I would advise you to do the same thing, I learned to answer questions about God by going to God's character. And say, I don't know the answer, but this is what we do understand about who God is. God is compassionate. God is loving. God is just. God is truthful. God is merciful. And you fall upon, when you don't know the answer, you fall upon, as they do, you fall upon the character of God Himself. You will see this with all those who knew God and walked with God, Old Testament and New Testament. They constantly would fall back on the character of God that God had revealed about Himself. And that became the foundation for their answer to their question, who God is. So they fall back on that. This is what He says in verse number 18. He urged them, this is Daniel, he urged them to ask the God of heaven to show them His mercy by telling them the secret, so they would not be executed along with the other wise men of Babylon. So this is what he tells them. We're going to fall back on the character of God. We're going to ask God to show us mercy. The second thing is they praise God then for His wisdom and His power. So if you look at verse 19, it says, that night the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven. He said, praise the name of God forever and ever, for He has, say this part with me, He has all what? Wisdom and... So it's even in this, he's still falling back on the character of God Himself. God is merciful to us, and God has all wisdom and all power, all ability. It all belongs to Him. He can do whatever He wants to do. The third thing is, they come to grips, and they came to grips with God's control. And this is how you come to grips with God's control. If this is God's character, if He has this ability, the truth is, then I look to and I listen to the fact that God is the one who controls things. And if you look at the next verse 21, this is exactly what He does. He says, He, meaning God, controls the course of world events. He removes kings and He sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise. He gives knowledge to the scholars. Verse 22, he says, He reveals deep and mysterious things, and He knows what lies hidden in darkness, although He is surrounded by light. That's actually the reason God knows what's in the hidden places, and the deep places, and the dark places, because God doesn't need those things exposed. He exposes them Himself. He is surrounded by light, so He sees what you and I could never see and what we can never understand. That's who God is. He sets up kings. He takes kings down. He sets up world events. God changes world events. It is an appeal to God for who He is, and then a coming to grips with and an acceptance of the fact that God can do anything that God wants to do. You know how that applies to you and me? Whatever you're facing today, whatever you're up against, whatever you say, this can't be done, guess what? God brought you to this time and place. And He didn't bring you to this time and place in order for you to be wiped out or destroyed or to have no answer. He brings you to this time and place so that you would look to Him. You would learn to rely on who He is and what His character is like. And when you do that, you can come to grips with the fact, yeah, and He's in control. He can do whatever He wants to do. You remember when Jesus was near the end of His life? And He begins to tell His disciples about the fact that He is about to be falsely accused. He's going to be persecuted. He's going to be shamed. He's going to be grilled, with things that, He has no answer for because it had nothing to do with who He was. And eventually, He would be sacrificed. He would be crucified, even though it was unjust, even though He had done nothing wrong. And you remember their reaction? They were like, this can't be. How can this be? How can God allow something like this? Well, because God is in control. And you fall back on God's character because God is still working His own plans, and His plans are always, listen, this is important, always for my good. They are always for my good. Even though I may not like them at the time, I may not understand them. I may ask God, I can't understand why you would bring me to this place and this time in my life. And we all end up in those places and those times. It is God's character that you fall back on. It's who God is that that you run to in the midst of those times. They also, it says, number 4, they thank God for giving them wisdom and strength. And He does. And He did with them. And this is what it says in verse number 23. It says, they said, I thank you and praise you, God of my ancestors. That means the one who's taken us this far. For you have given me wisdom and strength. You have told me what we ask of you and revealed to us what the king demanded. It's kind of interesting that the language is even that the king demands. They ask of God. And God, because of who He is, He gives to them wisdom and strength because of His character and who He was. Then number 5, they understood something. They understood that God was using King Nebuchadnezzar. That God was using King Nebuchadnezzar. See, it's taken them full circle, where they would have thought before, or maybe all the other astrologers said, King Nebuchadnezzar has got our life in his hand. He can do whatever he wants to us. If he desires to crush us, he will crush us. We must do, by hook or crook, we must figure out a way to please him. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are very different in this. They understand the character of God, and they understand, no, God has us in His hands. Nebuchadnezzar, yeah, he's there. He's powerful. But even Nebuchadnezzar, he's in the hands of God Himself. And God is working His ways and His plans even through King Nebuchadnezzar. This is in verse 30, the same chapter. This is when Daniel goes and he addresses the king. And just one of the verses in that latter part where he's addressing him, he says this in verse 30. But as for me, it says Daniel speaking to King Nebuchadnezzar, but as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than any other living man. That's incredibly humble, isn't it? Daniel is basically saying, it's not because I'm so smart or I figured something out or I know some method, whatever. He says, but for the purpose, and he's referring to God's purpose, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. That's pretty bold. King Nebuchadnezzar, God has done this so that you can figure out what you're even thinking, because you don't even know what you're thinking, right? You don't know what's going on in your mind. And it was true. Daniel's being very diplomatic and very respectful in doing this, but Daniel understands what God is doing, even though he doesn't know all the plans. He can't say, I can tell you everything that's going to happen. I just know that it is God who is working His own way. Can I tell you one little, quick little thing about life or about people? When we become like King Nebuchadnezzar, I know that there's this desire in our lives. I know I'm the same way. There's this desire in your life to say, I want to be everything, right? I want to have all power. I want to be able to do whatever I want to do. I want to be able to chase after my own heart and my own desires and just be, not answer to anyone in my life. But that's always a bad thing. It's always a bad thing. Because then the desires that come out of our life are not only the good desires in our life, but a lot of times it's the ones that we're like, ooh, where did that come from? And Nebuchadnezzar is one of these guys. He's become so arrogant and he's become so prideful. It will seem like, I would disagree with some other writers that say, see, Nebuchadnezzar became a believer. It would seem like that in some of his responses until then you go to the next thing where Nebuchadnezzar seems to have no regard at all for who God is. No regard. He views himself as, I'm the ultimate. It is my will and my desire, and I've risen to a place of power where I can have my will and my desire. Bad place to be. Bad place to be. If you recognize that God has put you under someone or in a position where you have to answer to someone, good thing for you. Because it's to help to remind you that you answer to God, as Daniel understands. When Daniel understands that he answers to God and God is above everything, you know what his response is to someone like Nebuchadnezzar? He shows respect. He understands who he is. He understands in that sense how the game is played. But Daniel has no real fear of Nebuchadnezzar. Not the same way that he has a fear or respect of God, who controls events, who causes the things that happen to happen. I like history. Y'all probably know that. And one of the things I like about the last 30 years or so is so much of World War II has come out. So, typical boy, tanks, guns, blow things up. But it's just interesting, to look at world leaders that we know so much about. And Hitler is one of those guys. In fact, I was reading a guy who says that Nebuchadnezzar would put Hitler to shame, in his own arrogance and his own will. But Adolf Hitler ended up, because of his own arrogance, because of his own thinking, I answer to no one, being his own worst enemy. If you go and you study World War II. And the last couple of years of his life, he is the one that actually caused Germany to fail because his decisions were so bad, and he wouldn't listen to anyone. In fact, there were some plots to assassinate Hitler that the Allies actually helped thwart the plots to assassinate Hitler because they didn't want him picked off. They knew, no, as long as he's in power, he is making such bad decisions, and he is so arrogant and so full of himself, he won't listen to the guys underneath him who are smarter than he is, and he doesn't listen anymore. So we don't want anybody to go assassinate Hitler. We want him to keep making really, really dumb decisions because that's how we're going to win the war. They were right. Actually worked out that way. When you don't answer anyone, when there's no real humility in your life or any sense that there's someone who watches over my life that I should have fear and respect for. That's the Proverbs, right? The beginning of all wisdom is what? Fear or respect for God. It's the beginning of all wisdom. Without that, you put yourself in a really, really, really bad place in life. Daniel is so amazing because Daniel understands this. And it keeps him from falling for every other trick or every other trap that he could have fallen for. Because Daniel had this relationship with God. Let's pray together. Dear God, we thank you that even from stories 2,500 years ago, we can still learn so much about who you are, who you have been in our history. And God, remember, everything ahead of us is still known to you. And God, we thank you that you call us to yourself. You sent your son Jesus into this world so that we really would know what your character was all about, what you were like. And we could put our hope and our trust in you, not in just in the things that we can control or that we can do, but in the God who made us, gave us life, sends his son into the world to prove his character so that we would see it like we've never seen it before. And would do the amazing thing, he would come to this world and convince us that despite our own failures, our faults, our sins, all of the things that we want to keep covered up in our life, that you know all of those things, and yet somehow you still love us. You still have mercy on us. Wow. And Jesus makes that so clear so that we could put our hope and our trust in you. We could come to you knowing that you know us anyway, and yet you still love us. If you're here this morning, you've never put your hope in God's mercy, Jesus Christ, and God's answer for what you're really struggling with and what you really need to know, which is Christ himself. The good news is that Jesus still changes lives. When people put their hope and their faith and their trust in him, it makes all the difference in the world as to how they live. So you could say something like, Jesus, I thank you for coming. I thank you that you love me so much that you're willing to suffer and to die for me and to give your life so that I would be free from my sins, my struggles, so I could live a totally different life, a totally new life. And as I go through this life with troubles and difficulties as well as wonderful times, I could still know that there's such a future ahead because of who you are, because of the compassion and the love that the Father has shown through you. Lord, come fill my heart. Lead me. In Jesus' name, amen.